Hello YouTube and welcome to another episode of Raw History. This week we're going to move away from the ancient world and look at something a little bit more modern and chronologically a little bit closer to home. Now there have been a lot of notorious prisons throughout history, but other than concentration camps, none of them seem to have gained the same level of infamy as Alcatraz. Famous names like the Birdman, Whitey Bulger and of course Al Capone all served a portion of their sentence on the dreaded rock, but despite what films and TV shows would have us believe in fueling the legend of the prison, the story of Alcatraz goes way beyond a simple jail. It was a site of war, incarceration, rebellion, and ultimately civil rights. There's a lot more to the rock than meets the eye, so yeah, it's gonna be fun.
We don't need no education.
So obviously the island of Alcatraz has been around for tens of thousands of years, but it remained unoccupied for a very, very long time. Interestingly enough, the local Native American group known as the Miwok stayed very far away from the island, which they believed to be evil and full of curses. Just a fun little segue that's not really relevant to anything, but the Native American Miwoks, who lived in the redwood forests of Northern California, are what the furry little alien Ewoks from Star Wars are named after, as their home planet was filmed in the redwood forests. There you go. That's my fact of the day. Anyway, that's enough with the Star Wars trivia, and back to the evil Isle of Alcatraz. Because of Miwok beliefs, the first known person to have set foot on the island was a Spanish explorer named Juan Manuel de Ayala, and in 1775 he named the rock La Isla de los Alcatraces, which in Spanish means the island of the seabirds. And I'm really sorry, I don't speak Spanish, so my pronunciation was probably really, really horrible. But fortunately for me, over time the name was shortened and anglicised to simply Alcatraz. However, nothing really exciting happened on the island for quite a long time, until in 1846 America went to war with Mexico. During the war, Alcatraz was an incredibly strategic place for defending the San Francisco Bay, also known as the Golden Gate. Although not because of the bright orange bridge that was built a lot later, but instead because San Francisco was thought to be the gate to all the gold in California. So in the 1860s, America went to war again, only this time it was with itself. And I don't think it's going to surprise you that it was during the Civil War that Alcatraz became a prison. Although it wasn't a regular prison for regular prisoners, in the late 1800s the Rock was used to house prisoners of war and Confederate sympathisers. Now, the Rock is in an exceptionally good position to be a prison. Like, it's close enough to the mainland that supplies and help can be shipped over very, very quickly, but the freezing cold waters and incredibly dangerous currents make swimming to freedom nearly impossible. Nearly impossible, and we're going to come back to this soon. So, in 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out, and this increased the prison population from 26 to over 450. And during World War I, a great number of conscientious objectors were sent to Alcatraz for refusing to fight. One of these prisoners, during his sentence, wrote the first ever expose of life in Alcatraz prison, which he referred to as Uncle Sam's Devil's Island. And the guy that wrote it, yeah, he committed suicide a few years later. And not long after the end of the First World War, Alcatraz, the military prison, closed down, and in 1934 it became the federal penitentiary that is so infamously renowned today. During the Rock's 29 years active as a federal prison, over 1,500 men served out their time, so close to the lights of San Francisco, yet so far from freedom. It was said that on busy evenings, or if the wind was just right, the prisoners could hear the talking and laughter of free San Franciscans from across the bay. Can you imagine what that's like, being able to taste freedom every single day, but having it denied? So, talking of the prisoners, let's just spend a little bit of time getting to know the most notoriously infamous men living in the most notoriously infamous prison. And let's start with the one that everybody's heard of, Al Capone. Capone was probably the most famous Prohibition-era gangster, and he was renowned for bootlegging and money laundering and murder, although his own arrest proved to be somewhat underwhelming. He was actually tried for tax evasion, and after spending a few years in Atlanta, he was moved to what? Alcatraz. The once great and proud crime boss, who'd been referred to by some of his supporters as a modern-day Robin Hood, was now a senile young man being driven insane by the syphilis that rotted his brain. There are reports that Capone spent the last year of his sentence just lying in the prison hospital, disoriented and demented. But not every man was so broken by his imprisonment. This is Alvin, better known as Creepy Carpus, and I shouldn't have to explain how he got his nickname. But I will, anyway, because... So, supposedly Alvin Carpus had a particularly terrifying smile, but on top of that, apparently he walked around Alcatraz all day on his tiptoes. Just imagine how spine-chilling that is, seeing this tall, lanky man walking around on his tiptoes, and ugh. I don't know why I find it so weird, but I imagine like Slender Man, that's what I'm picturing. And if that's not bad enough, Creepy Carpus is also the man who spent the longest time in prison on Alcatraz. He was there for 26 years. However, the most violent crime to ever take place on the rock itself occurred in 1946, and it's remembered today as the Battle of Alcatraz. So, on the 2nd of May, a 25-year-old robber called Bernard Coy attacked a guard from behind and then released 5 other prisoners. Coy had escaped from his cell with a little homemade device that he used to spread the bars slightly, and then he starved himself to fit through this little gap. After attacking the first guard, Coy then overpowered a second guard and stole his rifle, a pistol, 2 grenades, and some keys, which he shared with his accomplices. The 6 inmates then captured 9 more guards who they held as hostage, although their plans were scuppered when they realised that the door locking them in the cell house had been jammed. Realising that their initial plan had failed, the prisoners decided to take civilian hostages, namely the wives and children of the guards who always lived on the island, and this is what began the battle. Gunshots were exchanged and one of the lookouts was severely injured. At 6 o'clock in the evening, 5 armed guards stormed the cell house, but all of them were shot and one of them was killed. In the early hours of May 4th, which is 2 days after the initial escape attempt, a gang of Marines stormed the corridor and subdued the prisoners. 3 were killed in the fighting and 2 more were later executed by a gas chamber in 1948. When all was said and done, 7 men lay dead and 12 were injured in what will forever be remembered as the bloodiest event in Alcatraz's history. However, this was not the only escape attempt from the rock, and a few decades later came the most intricate escape plan ever devised on the island, and possibly the most amazing jailbreak scheme of all time. In June of 1962, only 8 months before Alcatraz was due to close, 3 men put in motion a plot that was nothing short of genius. Behind the 3 prisoner cells, there was a very small utility corridor, only 3 feet across, but it led to an air vent. The escapees chiseled through a concrete wall, just like in Shawshank Redemption, except instead of using an actual chisel, they used spoons. I'm not making this up, I swear. They used spoons to chisel through concrete, and they strengthened the spoons by soldering, like, silver onto the end of them from a dime. They also built a makeshift electric drill out of a stolen vacuum cleaner part. Wish I was as smart as those guys. But how did they disguise the sound of the drilling, you ask? Well, let me tell you. One of them played the accordion very loudly during music hour, whilst the other 2 worked behind him. And they constructed a fake wall to conceal all their progress with the tunneling. But wait, that's nowhere near it. They also built pretend heads. Yeah, heads. Out of soap and toilet paper, and they finished it off by stealing actual human hair from the barber shop. These dummy heads were then placed under the blankets of the prisoners' beds on the night that they planned to escape, so it looked like they were still sleeping. All 3 inmates then climbed through the air vents and onto the roof, and the former prisoners must have stood there for a moment and taken in the fact that they were the first people and only people in history to make it out of the cell block without being caught. I can't imagine what that must have felt like to look at freedom for the first time in years without prison bars in between. But wait, because that's still not it. The men used an inflatable raft that they had built out of 50 stolen raincoats, and they used it to sail away across the water. And, well, that is it. We don't know what happened to them. They were never found. Their bodies were never found. The raft was found on the shores of Angel Island, but there was no sign of the men who built it. They had just vanished. Now, over the years, a huge amount of research has been done to try and figure out what happened, but the truth is, no one, except maybe the 3 escapees, really knows what happened that night. Seriously, I really encourage you to check this out. When this video's over, just Google escape from Alcatraz. The whole thing is nuts. And there's a ton of really strong evidence to suggest that the inmates drowned in the icy cold water, but there's also a ton of evidence to suggest that they made land and escaped the US. No one knows, and that's what's so cool. However, this is not the end of Alcatraz. In 1963, the prison was closed due to costs and all the other inmates were shipped off to other jails around the country, but the island remained hugely significant due to another group of occupants who arrived in 1969. Now, the 1960s is well known as being the decade of the civil rights movements, mainly for African Americans, but also for women and other minorities. And it's hard to think of any other group with more historical reason to hate the federal government than Native Americans. And so, for 2 years, Native American activists occupied the island and declared it Indian land. The physical marks of this occupation can still be found all over to this day. It all started with 14 American Indians, led by this guy, Richard Oakes, and they snuck past the Coast Guard and set up shop on the island of Alcatraz. Over the next 2 years, they were joined by over 400 protesters. So, although Richard Oakes is often seen as the face of the movement, this woman, Lenada Means, was also hugely significant, as she wrote a lot of statements to the federal government demanding that Alcatraz fully belong to Native Americans. However, despite the fact that the occupation garnered a huge amount of public support, the whole thing did eventually end in tragedy when Richard Oakes' 13-year-old stepdaughter Yvonne slipped and fell to her death on the island. Although the demonstrators were forced to leave Alcatraz, they did have a hugely significant effect on American Indian civil rights, and they forced President Richard Nixon to pass into being new policies that ensured native well-being. And after that, Alcatraz became one of America's smallest national parks. Its plants and animals are now protected, and there's a large museum dedicated to anyone who ever called Alcatraz home. And I find this really interesting because before it was first occupied in 1775, the rock was just that, a rock, completely barren of any life other than the seabirds that nested on it. But because of the prison and the gardens that were tended by both the prisoners and the wardens' families, it's now a wildlife reserve, and that's kinda cool. And the other thing that I think's cool is the really nice symmetry that Alcatraz has. First, it was a sanctuary for birds, and then it became a significant place for Native Americans before it became a military prison. Then it became a regular prison before going back to being a significant place for Native Americans, and then it finally went full circle, and it's now a national park / wildlife reserve. And on that note, thank you very much for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss any more future raw history videos. And my head scratcher for this week is, why do people feel the need to sterilize a needle just before a lethal injection? Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next week.